I mean, why? If Caribbeans came to this country with a lack of value for education, with a lack of value for family, just wanting to be gangbangers and go to jail, why did they bother setting up 150 Saturday schools? Why did virtually ask anyone of my age? The difference between our grandparents and our parents, almost all of our grandparents stayed married till their dying day, even if they shouldn't have, because it was frowned upon back then. What we've got to deal with is a lot of the same people understand how 70s and 80s Thatcherism and that tumultuous period in British history, the collapse of the golden age of capitalism and all of that, people understand how that affected mining communities in the north. People understand how that affected East Glasgow. People understand how that affected Belfast. Suddenly don't understand how that affected Caribbeans who were concentrated in exactly the same type of manufacturing jobs. Yeah. And I find that quite fascinating, that that's hard to understand. So if you go to a lot of the former mining towns of the north, perhaps not on the same scale as London right now, but what will you see? You'll see alcoholism, you'll see drug addiction, you'll see low education, you'll see violence. You'll see many of the same problems that you see in Hackney, just in a completely different demographic. And apparently Caribbean immigrants to Britain are subject to different laws to all other human beings. And it's sufficient to say they brought this culture with them. And as I was arguing with a conservative woman on Twitter today, she didn't respond, obviously, because she has no argument. She says, there's some cultures that have fatherlessness at their core. And I said, okay, can you provide me just any data on the level of single-parent households in the actual Caribbean migrants that came from the Caribbean? So not their great-grandchildren.
No, the original.
So if the problem was fatherlessness that we brought with us, then you'd expect the violence, the problems, the knife. And actually the state in the post-war period commissioned a number of studies actually to try and prove that Caribbean migrants were a drain on British resources, that they were more likely to commit crime, all of which concluded the exact opposite. So the government didn't report them. They didn't release them publicly because they literally concluded over 95% of them are gainfully employed and they're no more likely to commit crime than anyone else.
And if we acknowledge that, then we're the ones with questions to answer.
Then now in this, and that doesn't free black people of self-responsibility. I have a lot of self-respect. I'm not like, Mighty Whitey is responsible for everything that's gone wrong in the world or in my life. That's not the argument. What I'm saying is, for kids in East Glasgow, even along a class level, for kids in Croxteth in Liverpool, to not acknowledge how their communities came to be the way they are is not helping them. So it has to be a combination of, yes, of course you have to work twice as hard in school. You can't expect, unfortunately the world is not fair. You can't expect something back for nothing, for giving nothing. At the same time, I've got to be honest with you and say to you, no, the world isn't fair.
So I haven't really, this hadn't occurred to me before, so I'm just thinking of all the symptoms of what you're describing, and obviously you've got addiction, you've got dysfunction, you've got violence, you've got endemic single parenthood, all of which would apply to what it's slightly unpleasant, but it's an easily understood phrase. You'd apply that to your kind of Jeremy Kyle demographic without ever stopping to wonder why we just presume that it's colour related for African Caribbean families.
Well, we presume that in London. I mean, if you go and ask people who live in the roughest council estates in Scotland, they call them schemies up there instead of chavs, right? So even if we were not here, it would be someone else. Before we got here,
the same problem.
It was the Jews and the Irish before we got here. Jewtown in East London at the turn of the century, there were a couple of acts of anarchist terrorism, and that was blamed on the entire Jewish community. Knife crime itself was said to be endemically Irish. Do you see what I mean? So this is not a new issue. Irish immigrants before...
No, but bits of it are. Because bits of it I know, and I'm struggling to keep up with you, I'm not going to lie, which is quite a novel experience for me. So what I'm hearing is a little bit guilt-inducing, if I'm honest, because it had never really occurred to me before that the problems within the black community in London were the same problems that you see within poor communities in other cities, and that they were a result of having the certainties that were provided by the combination of welfare state and a proper concept of society pulled from beneath the feet of your parents' generation without any safety net being put in place.
But also there were specific policies, and this again, like I said, none of this is often an excuse, but you can even look at the difference in education outcome today between later migrants who predominantly came from West Africa, who actually do significantly better in school than both poor white and black English. The black English are deliberately mislabeled Caribbeans, even though a lot of them have never been back to the Caribbean. This is the other problem. A lot of these kids who have been labelled Caribbean in the press have never visited Jamaica or Trinidad or Barbados. And if you look at educational outcomes, I mean, Barbados has something like 99% adult literacy. St. Lucia has the highest number of Nobel Prize.
It's just convenient.
Highest number of Nobel Prize winners per capita in the world, St. Lucia. Jamaica, despite being one of the poorest countries in the world, again, if you look at the educational output of the tiny fraction of Jamaicans that actually go to university, they're astronomically more intelligent than their cousins that live in Britain. And interesting is, American, right-wing black Americans like Thomas Sowell, for example, his argument in America is the exact opposite. He says Caribbean immigrants into America doing so well in school proves that the problem in America is not institutionalized racism because, look, the Caribbeans have done so well. So how is it our literal cousins that went to America apparently valued education, but the ones that came here didn't? So again, these structural issues, we're sort of, no one's saying that excuses people from personally doing anything with their life, but to ignore the difference as the original point I was making was that if later migrants from West Africa are doing significantly better in school,
then something's happened.
But if you look at the way the press reacts to that, the press reaction to that has been poor white boys left behind in the school system.
Yes, it has.
When the reaction should be, shouldn't we be teaching? Now, the reason why we know that's a racist reaction is because black boys, mixed heritage boys, and poor white boys, black English boys that is, fail at almost an identical rate now. Like it's like 1 or 2% ahead the black English boys are, and apparently that means the white boys are left behind. Yeah. Shouldn't we all be saying, why don't we all follow the West African kids and the Bangladeshi kids? Yes. Who still have that cultural value of education, rather than say we've been left behind.
That's quite depressing, isn't it? Because that suggests that the value of education was diminished in that generational gap. So that you came over, Windrush generation came over. It's a bit of a trite anecdote, but there's a great line in Andrea Levy's book about, I think one of the heroes of her book had lost a brother in the war who'd been flying Spitfires, and he just presumed that this would afford him heroic status when he got here, that it would somehow mean that, you know, he'd get treated as being a bit special because his brother had made the ultimate sacrifice. And when you realise the reality is that you're expected to know your place and you're expected to toe the line and you're also expected to endure some pretty grim attitudes, education suddenly doesn't seem to be the key to the kingdom that it was for previous generations, and that even subconsciously gets passed on to the next generation. So then when the West African kids arrive, for them the key is still real.
Yeah, of course. And we can literally see that in outcome.
Yes.
Give it 2 more generations. What it is...
What happens? No, don't jump ahead. What happens after 2 more generations?
Give it 2 more generations, and what will happen is they'll become acculturated. So the Ghanaian and Nigerian parents who are currently like, if you don't get a degree, you better leave my home.
Yes.
The more English you become... And that's not because the British class system only needs 2-3% of the public to be properly educated.
Yes, I know.
The Etonians and the kind of Oxbridge set, that's all you need to run the country efficiently. So lambasting kind of more working class communities for not becoming Roger Penrose or Richard Dawkins, when we're not encouraging them to do so anyway. We don't have a public language that encourages it. It's very strange.
It is very strange, not least because we're jumping around so much, but we may as well go all in.
Yeah.
We seem now to be seeing an education system that's even more geared, or is becoming more geared by every year, towards education being a means to an end rather than an end in itself. So what you've just described almost contradicts that, even though what you describe is accurate, because that 2 to 3% of people being needed to run the country, that means that you have to render education something that's a reward in and of itself rather than just a path to professional advancement. And yet our education system, especially at tertiary level, is now almost devaluing everything that can't be immediately translated into material benefit, or the degrees that don't deliver a job immediately. I think if the Brexit trajectory continues, they'll be the ones you have to pay for soon, and you might be able to go to medical school or engineering school for free. It's a strange sort of state of affairs.
And it's even stranger to primarily lay the blame at the people who don't have any power to make all of those decisions.
But if you can persuade the white people who, as you've just said, that their problems are actually caused by people like you, then nothing ever needs to get fixed.
Yeah, but I think what's fascinating, again, like I said, is how the state plays class.
Do you think that's because I'll tell you where I am politically at the moment. I'm on this weird... what do you call it? Almost like the top of a pyramid. I'm not quite sure which way I'm going to roll, because to think of it as all being deliberate, it's close to conspiracy, and yet the evidence mounts, especially with regard to the Windrush story that we've seen. That's the tip of an iceberg. I think there's a lot more to come out on this, as you will already know. Yeah. But the idea that it was a deliberate plan with an end game, I find almost too sinister to believe.
Which is understandable, given your lived experience.
Yes.
The first time I was searched by the police, I was 12.
Yes.
There was no adult present. I wasn't read my rights. When I tried, so a teacher at my school gave us, all of the young black boys in our school, he gave us a form with our rights on it because he knew it was going to get searched by the police at some point. So it's like, it doesn't matter what your grades are. I mean, you can be like me and go to the Royal Institution of Mathematics. I actually got searched. I talk about this once in the book. Yeah. I got searched on my way to the Royal Institution of Mathematics masterclasses once. And that was when it hit me. It was like, respectability politics don't mean anything. Because I was born in the bottom 1 or 2% of, you know, socioeconomically speaking. Academically, I was in the top 1 or 2%. It didn't change the fact that some of the people with the power just saw a criminal. And this was before I did become a bit of a naughty boy myself, and part of that trajectory was being treated like a criminal. The point I'm making is that for me, especially going to the kind of school I went to, I saw who was bringing drugs into school and who wasn't. And I saw who was getting searched and who wasn't. And the kids bringing drugs into school were the ones who could afford it. Yeah. Class A drugs anyway. Yeah. You know, the man, you know, they used to buy weed, I'm not going to lie. But in terms of drugs, sure. You know, it wasn't us. And so it was very clear to me very early that the lunacy of sort of ethnically targeted stop and search, which we want to bring back. When you even look at the numbers now, what this does is it doesn't help solve the problem. It helps make the problem worse for reasons that should be entirely common sense. Let's say there's roughly 1 million black people in London. I think it's like 800,000 somewhere in that region. Let's say there's 40, 50 murders a year, but let's just do it easy maths, right? 50 murders, because it's actually less than 50 usually. That means 5 in every 100,000, or to put it another way, 0.005% or whatever that is, actually kill somebody. Yeah. And if you look at the police's own reports, so researching this book, I did a lot of look at police's own reports from the days of Operation Trident. And in the reports they actually deliver, they understand very well the type of young black boys that are likely to kill people are not random at all. When you adjust for abuse in the home, when you adjust for expulsion from school, crucially, you start to see, oh, they're the same socioeconomic demographic as the kids who've been doing this in Glasgow or Liverpool or Sheffield in the 1920s or Middlesbrough. But we can ignore all of that. And so, ironically, treating the other 85, 90% of young black boys in Hackney who just want to go to school and get a job like criminals actually prevents us from allocating the resources where they need to go, which is helping the most vulnerable people. And the worst part about it is, if you're a kid, like my little cousin, for example, and you live on a council estate in Hackney, this hasn't happened to him, but this is very common, and you've been robbed 2 or 3 times growing up, you know, boys have pulled a knife out and you took your mobile phone, then you get searched by the police because of the very boys you're getting bullied by.
Yes.
Of course you're going to be peed off. It's natural. If we said, let's put it like this, this example I always give people. If we took the case of Jimmy Savile and Rolf Harris and whoever else, and we said, right, all middle-aged white guys in TV are potential paedophiles. Yeah. And let's police Andrew Neil on the assumption when he goes to pick up his grandkids, let's just stop and make sure they're his grandkids just in case because of what Jimmy Savile done. Yeah. This is what you get when you get collective blame, but we sort of accept it. And it's not, again, I don't even entirely blame the public, because when you have a language of public policy, when you have a language of media that emphasizes race whenever there's a negative story or a significant portion of time, but not when there's a positive story. So the 4 youngest kids to ever take GCSEs in Britain are also black. Race was not emphasised in any of the reporting. 6-year-old Joshua Beckford from Tottenham was studying philosophy at Oxford. His dad taught him. Naturally, race and certainly the black father was not emphasised, which in both cases is the case. So again, with the West African kids who are doing very, very well at school, thousands of them, race is not emphasised. No. It's emphasised in the negative. It's like the West African kids are doing better than we are. We need to fix this. And it's very interesting because the journalists who are writing that are not concerned with poor white kids failing. If you read I cite loads of them in there. They're concerned that poor white kids are failing relative to black kids. Yes. They're not actually concerned with poor white kids themselves. It's a sort of weird racial nationalism where we're okay for the chavs to fail.
It's got a touch of the whip hand.
Yeah, it's okay for the chavs to fail, but they shouldn't be failing more than the immigrants kind of thing.